How do you think a combat team assault would go against a prepared divisional defensive position? Let's find out in episode 6 of the Principles of War, Offensive Action in the Malaya Campaign.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Hey everyone, we're going to discuss offensive action. We're going to talk about seizing, retaining and exploiting the initiative here. Now, sadly enough, we don't really have a lot to talk about offensive action as far as the Allies go, and this is a fundamental problem. And this is why Malaya and Singapore fell so quickly, because of their inability to seize the initiative from the Japanese. So what we're going to talk about is probably the biggest effort that they came up with to actually seize the initiative, to actually conduct some offensive action. And that is Operation Matador. Now, in 1937, the officer commanding Malaya Command was Major General William Dobbie. And he got his staff to conduct an appreciation of what the invasion would look like. And that was actually conducted by Lieutenant Colonel back then, Percival, who would, of course, come back to command Malaya Command. Now, that appreciation showed that the Japanese were highly likely to invade at Kota Baru in Malaya and slightly north of that over the Thai border around Patani and to seize the ports in that area. This is exactly what happened in 1941, at the end of 1941. And yet, even with the foresight of 4 years lead up, they were unable to come up with a plan that would be able to stop that. Actually, let me rephrase that. They came up with the plan, they were unable to execute that plan. Now, that plan was Operation Matador. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to cross the border and seize the Thai ports and airfields before the Japanese would be able to get them and push all of their supplies through those ports. Now, the big issue was that they were invading a neutral country. So there was no point doing it once the Japanese had landed because they would have seized those ports. And they needed a couple of days lead time to be able to get across the border, clear away any defences if there was any, and go and seize those ports. Churchill wasn't a fan of that, and that was because of the fact that they needed to keep the neutral Americans on side, and they couldn't be seen to be the aggressors in this action. So Matador was approved as a plan in concept, but final approval for the execution of Matador retained with London all the way up until the 5th of December. So, and it was at that point that the ability to execute Operation Matador transferred to Brooke Popham. So he's the Air Vice Marshal in charge of the entire defences there. Now, as the commander from Far East Command, his staff they believed that London was transferring the responsibility for declaring war to Brooke Popham. And that was a hot potato that he wasn't really keen to have. So he didn't authorise Matador, but what he did was he got Heath's 11th Infantry Division on standby for Matador, if need be. They also needed to defend Jitra. We're going to talk about Jitra shortly. But he never authorised it. It's pouring with rain. Elements of 11th Infantry Division are left out in the rain. On the 6th of December at 1300, an RAAF Hudson recon flight out of Kota Baru spot the invasion force 300 kilometres out to sea, and they're heading straight for Malaya. Brooke Popham fails to authorise Matador at that point, but he continues to leave the 11th Infantry Division on standby. On the 8th of December at 09:15, he received aerial recon reports of transports offloading on the Thai beaches. So it's too late. Percival tries to regain some semblance of the initiative. Looking at the terrain just north of the Thai border. Now, just over the Thai border, there's a feature called the Ledge, which is a long defile over the main road that the Japanese are going to use to push into Malaya. Holding that feature would potentially allow them to hold up the Japanese advance for a week. And that week would be incredibly valuable to the defenders in Malaya. Now, Percival's got a force at a town called Crow, and he authorises Crow Col, or the column from Crow, to go and secure the ledge. The problem was that the commander of Crow Col didn't understand the in order to and the need for speed. The ledge, it's only 3 hours across the border. This is not a big move that needs to be executed. The sad part about it is it took them 51 hours to travel that distance. By the time they got organised, by the time they got moving, there was they encountered some light Thai border police opposition that stopped them for a night. We're talking about policemen here. We're not talking about organised military resistance. We're talking about border police. That stopped them for a night. The timings blew out, 51 hours to get there, and in the end, they were 6 hours late. And 11th Indian Division never got the time that they needed to be able to prepare to defend themselves. So this is right at the start of the Malaya campaign. And so a great plan to deny the Japanese the ports that they needed for the supplies that they needed for their advance was lost. And the cut-down version of that failed just due to an inability to move quickly enough. And we see this time and time again. The Allies just move too slow. They prevaricate, they vacillate, they can't make a decision in the timeframes that are available. And they had plenty of time to be able to do this. This lack of rapid decision-making occurred at a strategic level. There was a lot of it in London. It happened at an operational level between Brooke Popham and Percival. It happened at a divisional level. Below that, though, you started to see the genesis of the ability for offensive action at a small scale. So, and a good example of that is the ambush around the Gamas area. And we're going to talk about that later, where Australians were able to conduct a company-level ambush. It wasn't tactically perfect, but it was a significant morale boost for the Australian troops once they'd entered into the fighting. At company and battalion level, there were elements who were able to do this. So the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were very good at this. The Australians became increasingly adept at doing this. But this was only at a tactical level, and sadly it was just far too infrequently from far too few of the troops that were employed to enable them to be able to inflict any real delay on the Japanese. Now, let's have a look at what the Japanese are doing. So, LWD-1 talks about the application of manoeuvre, and the successful application of manoeuvre is underpinned by the principles of war. In addition, it possesses the following attributes: focus all actions on the centre of gravity, combined arms teams, orchestration, and mission command. All right, so what's orchestration? So, it's the arrangement of physical and non-physical actions to ensure their unified contribution to the mission. Orchestration requires a high level of cooperation within combined arms teams and is achieved through the disciplined application of accurate and discriminating fire, timely use of information actions, and effective integration with interagency elements. When lethal force is applied, it must occur with speed, surprise, aggression, and discrimination. Orchestration necessarily involves the coordination of interagency elements. Effective orchestration enables simultaneity, concurrent action throughout the mission space. Simultaneity, if achieved, will potentially overwhelm the decision-making capacity of the enemy and collapse the adversary decision cycle. So we're using orchestration to create simultaneity. The interesting thing that you have for the Japanese is the simultaneity that they create on the 8th of December. You have multiple invasions occurring across Thailand and Malaya. So they've orchestrated that. But not only that, on the 7th of December, and remember, we've got to cross the international date line, so a couple of hours after the landings in Malaya, you have Pearl Harbor occurring. Not only that, you've got the invasion of the Philippines. Not only that, you've got Wake Island being invaded. And not only that, you've got the invasion of Hong Kong. This is all occurring on the 8th of December. So all within 10 hours, they have invaded all of these places or conducted the raid on Pearl Harbor. Now, the interesting thing is that all of this was a secondary effort, because you've got to remember that the primary effort was the solving of the China problem. So, just imagine what it would be like to be one of the commanders in one of these theatres. So if you're Percival or Brooke Popham, you've got multiple landings, and on top of that, you're then hearing from above that the Americans have sustained significant losses in Pearl Harbor. Hong Kong has been invaded. The Philippines is being invaded. Look at the effect that this would have on the Americans, and look at the effect that it would have on Churchill. So Churchill was hoping that when Malaya was invaded, the Americans were going to come running and they were going to provide the troops and the ships required for the Singapore strategy to work. And yet they have been effectively, well, they haven't been taken out of the war, but their ability to conduct offensive operations has been significantly limited because of the strike at Pearl Harbor and the invasion of the Philippines, which all occur on the same day. Now, the way that the Japanese are going to fight, so a driving charge. Yamashita at an operational level, this is a driving charge. We are going to drive down the Malaya Peninsula as quickly as we can because we have to. We don't have the supplies, we don't have the logistics capability to be able to sustain a protracted campaign. And on top of that, we need to take Malaya, we then need to take Singapore, and then we need to move on to other operations. We need to be postured for future operations. So he needs to get this job done, and he needs to get it done as quickly as possible. So the driving charge is his key theme for the whole campaign. At a tactical level, that looks like the filleting attack, which is where, and so you've got to remember that a lot of this fighting is done on roads that are surrounded by jungle on both sides. Jungle, not great for tanks. The Japanese have got tanks though, and they're unopposed because the Allies don't have tanks. So what they're planned to do is to conduct these filleting attacks where they are just going to barrel down the road. Where that doesn't work, they're going to fight for the road, off the road. So they'll bring up infantry. The infantry will then move around the flanks and dislodge the defenders. So from an operational point of view, Yamashita makes a really interesting decision. His 56th Division, which is part of 25th Army, he lives in Japan because he realises that he doesn't have the resources required to be able to supply it. The Imperial Guards Division, it's their job to secure Thailand, and in particular to secure Bangkok. Not only that, the 1st Regiment and a brigade headquarters from 18th Division is to invade northern Borneo. So this leaves 30 of his 42 infantry battalions for the operations in Malaya. Now, this is not a Schwerpunkt. This is not concentration of force. I cannot help but wonder how this would go in a shoot. Can you imagine briefing? I'm going to advance with 1 to 3 numerical inferiority whilst allocating 25% of my forces to secondary aims. I don't think that would go down too well. But good generals apply the principles of war. Great generals know which of the principles they can pay off. Because the principles aren't equal and their value in changing circumstances changes. So it's your ability to be able to pick the ones that are really important for what it is that you're trying to do and what it is that your opponent is trying to do. And we can see this in the way that Yamashita came up with his concept of operations. So his original plan saw a 5-week build-up of forces in southern Thailand and Kota Bharu. So Kota Bharu there's an airfield there, and it's just south of the Thai border. In autumn of 1941, the Taiwan Army Research Section urged the General Staff to have a rethink about this. And there was a couple of reasons for that. 1, the British defences were being reinforced. 2, the Japanese shipping was badly overstretched. And 3, the Japanese fighting power would be superior on the ground and in the air. So what they were trying to do here was to get inside the reinforcement cycle of the Allies. They needed to secure Singapore before it could be effectively reinforced. because they knew that the economies were larger for the Allies and they would be able to outsupply them if they were given the time to be able to do that. So the IGA would seize, retain and exploit the initiative by taking the risk to run ahead of their supply lines and drive the enemy back without pause. This is the driving charge. Kiramono Sakusen. Yamashita was prepared to violate Thai neutrality to gain the advantage of the port and the airfields and the easy access to northern Malaya, rather than invading in northern Malaya and then having to fight his way south and west, which would have taken too long. He's now got multiple fronts that he's able to operate on, and he's got secure ports from which he's able to bring his supplies in. And he's able to create an operational tempo at a strategic and operational level which the defenders are unable to match. And also usually at a tactical level. And this operational tempo, this is where the rubber hits the road, at the tactical level. So what I want to do is to give you a couple of examples of where this operational tempo and this fanatical drive to seize the initiative really does pay huge dividends at a tactical level. Now, the first one is the Battle of Jitra. So Jitra is just south of the Thai border, towards the western side of Malaya. So you've got Kota Baru on the east, big mountain range dividing the two, and Jitra on the western side. And so as they've come down from the port, they're able to move down the roads and they come across the forces at Jitra. Now, it wasn't great ground to fight on, but it was required to defend the air base at Alor Star. This is an important point. I want you to dwell on this. So the 11th Indian Division, so they've been postured for Operation Matador. They need to provide the forces for Crow Col, the column to go in and seize the ledge. But they also need to maintain a divisional defensive position. Now, this divisional defensive position is not fully developed. So not all of the pits have been dug, not all of the anti-tank obstacles have been put in place, not all of the mines are out, not all of the weapons have been sighted. And that's because they only had a year to work on developing the defensive position. They only had a year to develop the defensive position. Now, I don't know how many siestas that you have there. There were issues with budgets. I think Percival was only able to sign off on requisitions below £500, I think it was. It was a very low amount. They were unable to get any extra workers to be able to develop the positions because the focus was on getting the tin mines and the rubber, that nothing could interfere with that. But seriously, a year? How long does it take to dig in? Now, the other issue that the 11th Indian Division had was that they'd been left in the pouring rain awaiting Op Matador. And it was only on the 8th that they'd been ordered to move to their defensive positions in Jitra. So I know it sounds a little bit soft that they've been left out in the rain. The rain in Malaya can be quite severe. It's torrential downpours. So it does significantly inhibit your ability to move, to see, to communicate, and the effect on morale would be fairly major as well. Now, on the Japanese side, you've got Lieutenant Colonel Saeki. He's the CO of the 5th Division Recon Regiment, which is called the Saeki Detachment. And so it's a recon battalion with 19 tanks, engineers, light artillery, in total about 500 troops. Now, he trained his troops very aggressively. Like, we like to think that we train our troops aggressively. This takes it to a whole new level. To push through regardless and run over the enemy or even friends and advance until immobilized. So this gives you an understanding of the flavor of the training that these troops have got. Very aggressive. And so they attack at Jitra by the Saeki detachment after penetrating the Indian screen just north of the border. The 11th Indian Division, they didn't realize that the Japanese had tanks forward. So you've got 14,000 troops in a divisional defensive position with 36 anti-tank guns and 50 field guns. They're laid out in a conventional east-west line with the intent of forcing a deliberate attack and imposing at least a week's delay on the enemy. Now, the problem was that the placement of the troops on the ground left a gap along the road that Saeki could exploit. And Colonel Tsuji, He wrote a book about the advance, and he was driving behind in a captured car, behind the tanks. And he said that as they were driving through the Indian position, there were the barrels of unmanned guns pointing at them. They're basically driving past these guns because the Indian troops were sheltering out of the rain. There is some resistance. The divisional commander requests to withdraw. That permission is withheld. It is given at 20:30, but by then the position was becoming increasingly confused and night has fallen. And so the withdrawal turns into a rout. 11th Div left 50 field guns, 300 trucks and armoured cars, and 3 months' worth of ammunition and food in the field for the Japanese. And this is the first example of what we call the Churchill Supplies. Now, Yamashita is going to be driving as hard as he can, and his logistics guys are going to really struggle to keep up with the forward troops. How much easier do you think their job is when 3 months' worth of ammunition and food is left for them? That makes life a lot easier. Also, 300 trucks, they'll come in handy. The Indians took 3,000 casualties, 75% of whom were captured. 2/3 of the division had not even fired a shot. Alur Star was abandoned by the RAF at the start of the battle. We've talked about that before. The runway wasn't properly destroyed. So by the end of the day, the airfield has Japanese aircraft taking off using bombs that had been provided by the British and using fuel that had been provided by the British. How much easier does this make the logistics battle when you're using supplies that come from your enemy? So the assault on Jitra was reckless. 500 troops against a semi-prepared divisional defensive position. There's a couple of things, though, I think. One, north of the Thai border, after one of the skirmishes, a blood-smeared map had been found that detailed the defensive positions in Jitra. It was found in an armoured car, and the troops inside it had been killed. That showed the layout of the defences. Recon showed gaps in those defences. But you still have to wonder, how would you brief this to your commander? I'm going to conduct a regimental assault on a divisional position with morale and offensive action as being my tactical advantage. So this was 500 troops assaulting 14,000. And yet, it was a stunning success. Now, Murray Lyon was relieved of command on the 23rd of December, and this is one of the first of those back 'em or sack 'em type cases. And it's interesting where there's a lot of jockeying for positions once the real shooting war starts, because it's at this point that you realise who of your div, brigade and battalion commanders have got it and who haven't. So Murray Lyon was relieved of command on the 23rd of December. Percival said that this withdrawal would have been difficult under the most favourable conditions. With the troops tired, units mixed, as well as the result of fighting, communications broken and the night dark, it was inevitable that orders should be delayed, and in some cases they should never reach the addressees. This was what happened, in fact what happened. Some units and subunits withdrew without incident. Others, finding themselves unable to use the only road, had to make their way as best they could across country. On the left flank, there were no roads, and some parties reached the coast and, taking boats, rejoined further south. Some, again, were still in position the following morning. The fact is that the withdrawal, necessary as it may have been, was too fast and too complicated for disorganised and exhausted troops whose disorganisation and exhaustion it only increased. Now, this is the first battle, and already Percival's description there, that sounds like the troops have been placed in a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which they cannot cope. This is it. Now, while this is going on, there's an air raid on Pinang and 2,000 civilian casualties occur. And after that, Percival says that that all available air force will be for the defence of Singapore. So early in the campaign, there is a significant setback as far as cooperation or available air force assets goes. 11th Indian Division pulls back and they move down to a position at Slim River. 12th Indian Brigade moves up, and their job is to impose delay on the advancing Japanese. And they do this quite well. So this is where you've got Colonel Stewart of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. The Battle of Kampar is fought. which is it's quite a good victory for the British. They impose the delay. They only leave Kampar once they are outflanked. So Yamashita realises that he's unable to take the position at Kampar. So what he does is he orders an amphibious landing south of the Kampar area and dislocates them from their defensive position, dislocates the British from that position. In order to protect their withdrawal route, they need to leave Kampar. They then fall back, and the next we have the Battle of Slim River. And this is the last decent defensive ground before Kuala Lumpur. Now, north of the river, there's a very long defile for about 20 kilometres. And Simpson, who is the engineering officer, he identifies various locations for anti-tank traps, and he sends a whole heap of supplies forward. Mines, bollards, the normal equipment that you would expect for the engineers to be able to impose delay on an armoured force. The 25-pounders and anti-tank guns are sent to the rear. The mines and obstacles are not moved forward. The forward battalion had one anti-tank gun, no mines, and no experience fighting tanks. The road had been straightened in an effort to make it easier to get supplies to the tin mines and the rubber plantations, and that left a whole heap of loop roads, which the British were kind of going to use but decided not to. They didn't mine them, but they didn't observe them, which gave the Japanese a lot of freedom of manoeuvre. The 11th Indian Division was forewarned of iron land ships moving south, but they decided that the Japanese would wait until morning. I'm not sure where that idea would have come from. I'm not sure whether it's lack of understanding but they've already been beaten by a very aggressive force at Jitra, and that message just doesn't sink in. So they're attacked at 0330 with 30 medium tanks. By 0730, the tanks are into the rear areas and they're surprising units as they advanced. The Gurkha units watched them drive by as they had no anti-tank weapons. They destroyed anti-tank guns that were being moved up to support the battalions in contact, and they were destroyed before they could be unhitched. Now, the decisive terrain of this battle was the road and railway bridges over the Slim River. The advance was halted 4 kilometres south of the bridge by a battery of 25-pounders which had been moving to the sound of the guns and ended up firing over open sights to stop the tanks. Casualties on both sides, the Allies lost 500 dead and 3,200 captured. Japanese had 17 killed and 60 wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, who had been temporarily acting as the brigade commander for 12th Brigade, he was expecting a flanking move, not a filleting attack. Complacency, fatigue, low morale versus a high morale force equipped with tanks and a significant amount of audacity. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Harrison, a British artillery commander who narrowly escaped being killed by Lieutenant Watanabe's tanks, remarked, heedless of danger and their isolation, they had shattered the division. They had captured the Slim Bridge by their reckless and gallant determination. Now, Colonel Stewart, when he wrote to the official historian after the war, he said, I am rightly criticised for the location of brigade headquarters and for not using the field artillery in an anti-tank role. It is no excuse, but I had never taken part in an exercise embodying a coordinated anti-tank defence or this type of attack. The use of tanks on a road at night was a surprise. So let's just break that down into the components of it. So he was rightly criticised for the location of brigade headquarters. It was too far away. He was unable to communicate with his troops. He hadn't used his field artillery in an anti-tank role. This is where the system has let him down. Because you've got to remember, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, he's one of the good guys in this. He labelled a crank by Malaya Command because he had his troops out exercising too much and he was doing all sorts of crazy stuff. It was the Argyll and Southern Highlanders who were probably the best unit on the Allies' side of the whole campaign. And that was fundamentally because of the training and the doctrine that Colonel Stewart had put together. So he's one of the good guys. But he had never taken part in an exercise embodying a coordinated anti-tank defence, or where he'd had to defend against tanks using a road at night. And I think there's a couple of elements of this. Obviously, armoured doctrine was developing. One would have thought that the artillery doctrine would have been pretty robust by this time, but I think it was the surprise of using tanks on a road at night. That was the thing that was the big undoing of 12th Brigade. So Stewart had been given temporary command of 12th Brigade. He went back to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, what was left of them after Slim River. Now, he's had some very, very stressful times, and on immediately coming out of Slim River, who was there to greet him but General Sir Archibald Wavell. And Wavell says of the briefing that Stewart gives, well, I've never listened to a more garbled account of an operation. You got to feel sorry for the guy having fought such a terrible battle and then having to brief a general, a full general at that. But for anyone who's ever given a particularly bad briefing to a senior officer, it doesn't necessarily have to be a career-limiting move. Wavell, after this, became increasingly enamoured with 8th Australian Division, particularly because Major General Gordon Bennett had been really pumping the tyres of 8th Division and its capabilities, realistically more his capabilities. But it was later that Wavell realised Lieutenant Colonel Stewart had done. And he said that if all units in Malaya had been led with the same foresight and imagination that Brigadier Stewart showed in the training of his battalion, the story of the campaign might have been different. It was the realisation of this that led me to order Brigadier Stewart's return to India to impart his knowledge and the ideas to units preparing for the return match with the Japanese. With the imminent fall of Singapore, it was viewed as critical that Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was evacuated from Singapore. He then went to India. He became the chief instructor at the School of Infantry and went on to become the Brigadier General Staff training with 11th Army Group in India. He was the most knowledgeable of the officers who'd returned from Singapore, and it was his knowledge that had a direct input in the way that the training and doctrine was developed for the jungle fighting that was to follow throughout the rest of the war. So there you have it, lack of offensive action at a strategic and operational level for the Allies against an fanatical adherence to seizing the initiative with the Japanese. And I've chosen these two battles because they're sort of emblematic of the way that the campaign was fought. And it really does highlight the pressure that the Allies were put under and how the Japanese were able to create that turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which they couldn't cope. The next podcast, we're going to look at security. Now, this is a really interesting one because it's the one that the Japanese pay off big time. They throw security to the wind in some respects, and in some cases they pay quite a high price for doing that. And we're also going to look at surprise. On the Allied front, we're going to look at how do you surprise yourself when you've got decades of warning. That's it. I hope you've learned something interesting today. Bye.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.